Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Wow, that was fast. We are going to move into a time of sharing memories and stories from John's life. And Tony is going to be emceeing this time. We'll have a couple of mics going around. This will be recorded, video recorded, just FYI. So you might want to make sure your hair's okay if you're going to say something. I would like you to join me in prayer, if you would. I would like you to, thank you. Join me in prayer, if you would, before we begin our sharing. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We remember with gratitude John's life and all that he meant to each one of us. We ask your blessing upon his memory and upon each one of us as we share around these tables. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tony Lapp. I'm John's nephew. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here inviting people to share stories. We thought we would start by opening it up to family members, asking if there's any stories from family, and then we want to open it up to anybody else to share stories that you might have about your experience with John. For the younger ones here, just in case these are stories that are being told about people that you're not connected to. I thought I have a proposal for a little activity. There's a few tables around here that have people sitting at them that are capable of recreating the described West African donkey laugh. What is it? Trying to cough their heart out. So there are Wilbur buds over there. So this isn't an event where there's going to be alcohol, but there are Wilbur buds. So if you hear a donkey laugh, maybe that's a time to eat a Wilbur bud. Okay, so we're going to open it up. Anybody that wants to share a story, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
I'm Jessica Lapp, John's youngest daughter. Someone would say the most beloved. Or the most forgotten over the years. No. It's difficult to pick specific moments, as there were so many in the rich and varied life he provided for us. One is the way he lifted his hands whenever he saw us and welcomed us into his home for a visit. On a more serious note, I once asked him while he was working with MCC if he ever got disheartened by the poverty and violence evident in the world, and he looked honestly shocked by the question. He paused a minute, then he said something along the lines of, "I have to do what I can do to make a difference." This helped me to understand that his global perspective kept that individual perspective as well to keep him balanced and not overwhelmed. He also relied on a strong network of family and friends to keep that positive outlook. Last week at Mary Oyer's memorial, Rebecca Slough, who's helping in the kitchen today, noted that Mary Oyer was able to have such an exceptional professional life partly because she was not married, and this allowed her to take opportunities as they arose. My father experienced the opposite. For him, marriage to my mother enabled him to focus on his profession and to pursue those global issues that interested him. She took care of the practical daily details of the life. She was his strong left arm up to her passing last year, and he continued to use we instead of I when he talked. For a preacher's son from a conservative Mennonite community in Lansdale, Pennsylvania, and a farmer's daughter from Lidditz, Pennsylvania, they had an amazing life together, and they gave their children and their grandchildren a loving legacy of service to the world. Thank you.
Since it seems like we have a lot of shy Lapps around, I'll go ahead and read too. Some of my earliest memories of Dad were kind of a bit strange. If any of you have watched wherever the screens are, during the beginning of the service and when you first walked in here, there's one where Dad's riding along on a bicycle with a wire basket in the front. And I have a very clear memory of riding in that basket. I can't imagine how uncomfortable it must have been, but that it was such a thrill because Dad was taking me somewhere. I don't remember either taking me or bringing me home from nursery school or something like that. But I can remember I was 6 when we moved away from Harrisonburg, so I was pretty young when he would have done that and pretty small. The other kind of funny memory I have is in one of the coat rooms at Lidditz Mennonite Church in Lancaster County, where we must have been visiting our Weber grandparents. I can remember walking in that room looking for Dad, and I guess I was little enough, I was just looking at shoes. And I went up and I hugged a pair of knees, and it wasn't my own Dad, but apparently the shoes were similar. And I can remember Dad picking me up and laughing. So those were 2 of my very early memories. I remember trips to so many places around the world, but also just around the U.S. when we'd go all the way out to California to visit aunt and uncle and cousins, and also to Washington State to visit the same families, and to Oregon. Jessica and I at least visited Jim and Nancy Lapp's family there. And I do remember on those trips we had to stop at every historical site there was, and I had books and I wanted to sit in the back seat and read and didn't really want to get out. And I remember some frustration from Dad that we did not always want to participate in some of those trips that he would have found extremely educational. Dad always said he was proud of us, even though we know he didn't always agree with all of our choices. And he was a loving parent and always asked when we called or he called us how we were doing, how were things at our church, how were the kids, how was school going. And he, even within the past couple of months last summer when I'd call, he would still be asking some of those same questions, although he knew the kids were grown by then. But his last few months were difficult, but we hope that he knew how much we truly loved him and will miss him.
I'm Dan. I'm the number 4 in the family. So Jim's right behind me, and Mary's next. But John and Mary were the teachers. And it doesn't surprise me that they were teachers all their lives, because they taught us when I was 3, 4, 5, 6. I was learning things far before most people because they were good teachers. They taught us baseball, football, croquet, kickball, anything we played, EV-IV over. We did all kinds of stuff, and they taught us, and that was wonderful. They also helped us in our family, where church was so very important, that we never disliked going to church. It was just part of our life. And the story is that I wanted to tell about John was when he was about 5 to 7, somewhere in that neighborhood. A visiting preacher from Lancaster County, Irelandus, if anybody remembers that name, was driving past our church, and John was in the car. They were going to another Mennonite church, and they were going past Plains Mennonite, and John said, "This is my church." And Ireland has used that in his sermons many times. And the interesting thing to me is that like 2 years ago or so, I had many calls from John. John called and he said, "Would you come and pick me up? I'm stuck in the basement of Plains Church." And it just kind of, I think is something I treasure because Plains was important to him. It's still my church, so it's important, so I like the idea. But anyway, he was stuck there, and he called me one day, and he called me at least 3 different times that he was stuck in the basement of Plains Church, and I had to come and rescue him. Well, he was out here in Indiana. I tried to tell him, but I still thought this is my church, and it remained his church, and he always identified with it. Thank you.
I'm almost the next brother. I'm number 6 in this family, and I'm the 5th of 5 brothers. I'm Joe. And I went to Eastern Mennonite, I say university because that's what we became. It was college, but it's university now, to EMU in 1962. And John was holding forth as History of Civilization professor, and it was a required course for general education and for most education majors and for almost everybody, and the word was around. It was the best course of the whole university. So he was very influential in that regard. But he was personally influential as a mentor to me in many ways, and the one was after college, Hannah and I went to Chicago for service, and we were in Chicago, and I was doing my service in community service for a year, and then in the hospital for a second year. And at family get-togethers, I was wondering out loud, where the question to me was, what are you going to do after service? And I said, I don't know. And John, as off the cuff, said, why don't you try law school? And I don't know that I had thought about it much, but I decided, I will try law school, and took the LSAT scores. I was never the greatest student, but I was able to get admitted in Chicago-Kent College of Law, and so the rest of it is kind of history. But that was a framework for me to then go on. I got other training to get me to EMU, administration, etc. So he was very influential in giving those suggestions within the family.
I'm Eva Lapp, 4th grandchild, 2nd child of John and Sandra. And trying to think about what to share, I was reminded of a conversation that I had with my older sister, Sophie, earlier this week. Sophie is on the phone right here with Ethan, zooming in from Germany. And Sophie and David have a 1.5-year-old, Timothy. And this past week, one of Timothy's daycare teachers, providers, told Sophie and David that Timothy just really enjoys food. He enjoys eating food. He enjoys sharing his food. He enjoys eating other people's food. He just really gets a lot of enjoyment out of food. And just thinking about how that, I think, just is indicative of our whole family too, and Grandpa's great enjoyment with food. And so a couple food memories that I have with Grandpa. I don't know how, if this one is something that was consistent throughout his life, but I have memories of Grandpa spreading butter on cinnamon rolls, which is a Lapp thing, which is an interesting choice. I can't say I do that myself, but I also have a lot of memories of Grandpa with ice cream. He loved ice cream, liked taking grandkids out to get ice cream, and also maybe a Lapp family thing, never licked his ice cream cone, always just used his lips, which is another interesting thing that I haven't seen other people do. But yeah, so those are two food memories. I guess I also have a lot of memories of preparing sweet corn at Grandma and Grandpa's house in Akron, and always being worried about coming across a worm and having to give that one to Grandpa to finish off. So yeah, those are a couple memories, but just getting a lot of enjoyment out of food, sharing food with family.
I'm Ruth Lapp Gingrich, number 8, since we're giving them numbers in order here. The story I want to tell is one that I think our sister Mary would tell if she were here. She's not able to be here. And she told me this story long ago, and it's just stuck with me. It's a great story about the kind of person John was. John, Mary, and Jim went to Culpsville Public School for their first several years. Actually, John continued there until he finished, was it 10th grade, and then went to Eastern Mennonite High School. In their early years, Mary was standing at the door of her room watching the students go down the hallway to the assembly hall to see a movie. And all of a sudden, she sees John in that lineup. And they were not allowed to go to movies, and they had to pay a nickel or a dime to go to see the movie. And I'm not sure when she accosted John on this, but she said, "How did you get the money to go to see the movie?" And John said, "I saved my nickel for ice cream, and instead of buying ice cream, I went to see the movie." Which taught Mary, and probably Jim, that they could do the same thing. They could save their ice cream money and use it for movies instead. I think maybe that was something that carried on in John's life, figuring out how to beat the system when necessary.
I'm Abner Hirschberger. John and I go back quite a ways, but not as far as some of you, as I'm learning. But when he came to Goshen College and was in the dean's office, I made an appointment to go in and find out whether we could begin a program in the art department that we would call the commercial art direction. We didn't go that route earlier, and it was there was a pros and cons to that. But in the process, talking about design, we got off to discussing our 1W experiences. And we spent more time talking about how to make a hospital bed as an orderly or in that position. We both did our share of making up a hospital bed. And there are a couple of ways to tuck in the foot end, 2 points of view. And people will argue, they'll argue to the death, which is the better way to tuck in the foot end. I could have asked my wife, and she would have told him as a nurse, but she wasn't around. And anyhow, John and I were talking about this and other experiences. And the time was up, and I needed to leave, and needed to make another appointment to come back to find out whether we could have a commercial art program. And I got back to the art department, and they said, well, what's the decision? And I said, well, all I can tell you is that my way of tucking in the bed was better than John's.
Very nice. I'm sorry. Here you go.
My name is Vic Stolzfus. I speak as a personal friend, and also I was an academic dean who reported to John when he was provost at Goshen College. I'm here because of John. After I'd worked 15 years in public universities, John came to interview me along with the search committee, and they decided that I should be invited to come, and that was life-changing for me. After his MCC work, he moved back to Goshen, and we became quite close personal friends, and also we met every several weeks as members of a small group, so I was frequently with John. And Jenny Schwarzenhuber, here at this table, summed up his impact very well with this phrase: he was humbly patient and full of wisdom. Humbly patient and full of wisdom. This afternoon, I want to, even though this has been intentionally de-emphasized, I want to say a little bit about his work as a scholar. He did graduate with a PhD from an Ivy League school, the University of Pennsylvania. One of his first books was entitled Peacemakers in a Broken World with Arnold Snyder. It has already been mentioned that he had these global history, Mennonite history books from 5 continents, and I remember his being frustrated with that project because authors from some other continents have a different cultural view of time. And he almost had to harass some of those authors to get their work in on time. He wrote a book on the Mennonite Church in India. He gave an address to Mennonite graduate students entitled The Christian Historian as a Prophet. And many of you who are older will remember his book reviews in the Mennonite Weekly Review. He almost came up with a book every week. I don't know how he found time to read all those books. And a number of Mennonite authors looked to John to write the foreword for their books. In 2004, Norman Krauss wrote a book on global history, and John wrote the foreword. I went and reread his foreword, and he had his own illustrations of Norman Krauss's main points, and went on to make that book in his foreword, just a page and a half, a very attractive and inviting foreword. But I returned to the everyday John Lapp. With Alice, they entertained faculty in their homes, and he also told me a secret about the Goshen College faculty. There were several of them, about 4, that were regarded generally as academic stars. But he told me they had a lot of self-doubt. And every now and then you have to remind them that they're okay and reassure them that they have a right to some self-respect and a place on this faculty. We've already heard a number of references to that wonderful laugh. I'm glad it was rehearsed at MCC because it sure continued here. Late old age was not kind to John. He suffered losses of body and mind. He needed a cane and then a wheelchair, and he grieved those losses, and we were close enough that we could talk about them. He smiled and said, "Old age is old age." Although body and mind failed, his God, his family, and friends were faithful to him to the very end.
Hi, I'm Rosanna Landis-Weaver, and I'm actually reading 2 statements from Stuart Showalter and then Shirley Showalter. And I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this. This is from Stuart. John A. Lapp was an energetic 29-year-old history professor at Eastern Mennonite College when I first encountered him in 1963. He taught the required 2-semester history of Western civilization to me and more than 100 other first-year students. He opened our eyes to alternate interpretations of history. He focused particularly on power alliances and power conflicts between the church and the state throughout the centuries. I next encountered John directly 13 years later when I was a first-year professor at Goshen College, and he was the academic dean. He created for me a part-time teaching load combined with a part-time editing position at the Mennonite Board of Missions. As a result, I not only had a full-time position with benefits, but could also develop my interests and skills. A few years later, when John was provost, John had provost responsibility added to his role, he was my direct supervisor as I led a newly organized public relations department. After that, he was my direct supervisor when I chaired the communications department. After John left Goshen to become executive director at MCC, he asked me to serve as a communication consultant for MCC. Together, we consolidated more than 20 departmental newsletters into a substantive new magazine called A Commonplace. It continues today as an effective interpreter of MCC's mission and a winsome way of inviting ongoing constituent support. In all of these roles, John demonstrated a passion for advancing the mission of the church. He understood that education with an Anabaptist perspective was essential in helping keep the church's emphasis on service and peace vibrant. He always appreciated the part that strong journalism plays in keeping that mission relevant in an ever-changing world. I will be forever grateful to John for his leadership in helping to shape my own life. And that was Stuart, and this is Shirley Showalter. When I think of John, I think of his high-pitched, all-out, one-of-a-kind laugh. I am sure everyone in this room remembers it, clearly. What kind of things made him laugh? A well-told joke, certainly, but more often, it was something more spontaneous, an incongruity, something precocious spoken by a child, a folly or a foible made public, a pretension punctured, a signature phrase from someone he admired. John was a mentor to me, so I think of his laughter with fondness, but I cherish much more than that. Without his influence in my life, I might have led a different life. The first major influence was my professor at EMC. He was young then and had a reputation for being a hard grader. In fact, we did a first-year scavenger hunt, and a rare item to find on the list was a History of Western Civilization test from John Lapp that had an A on it. I was happy to produce one. John made the subject come alive, gesturing with his famously splayed fingers and offering a larger context than just dates and events from the past. He taught history with a textbook in one hand and the New York Times in the other. He made it relevant and exciting. So much so that I asked the dean to allow me to take his 400 political level theory course when I was just a sophomore, and to substitute this notoriously challenging class for another 200 level course, which would have been much easier. I loved the sense in that class that my brain was expanding and that the past was living in the present. John had a way of challenging his students to make their own connections. When he got excited by an idea, we got excited too. And if you were the one who contributed to the idea, he honored you by playing with it and inviting others to do the same. The second major influence John had on me was recommending me for a Danforth Fellowship. I was a finalist, but did not get the fellowship. Nevertheless, I was honored, and John saw a future professor in me in the year 1969, when most history departments were 100% male. He put the idea in my head to get a doctorate, and perhaps someday follow him in his own profession of college teaching. I remember him saying clearly, we need more women in the history profession, and we need more books about men. The other major influence John had on me was when, in 1976, John, an academic dean, called both Stuart and I to come to Goshen College after Stuart had finished his PhD and I'd finished my coursework. We thought we were coming for 3 years. We ended up staying for 28. Choosing Goshen over other options was possible in part because we loved our own experience of Mennonite education, and we were open to a calling when John offered the possibility. I was also able to offer a course called Womanhood in America, the first women's study class offered at Goshen. I took that. Were you in that with me, Jessica?
But I was jealous that I didn't take it.
I had designed that class at the University of Texas, partly because I remember John saying we need more women in history. I tried to thank John privately in the later years of his life for his many gifts to me. If this public tribute sounds too serious, John, I'm sorry. I really would love to hear your laugh one more time. So that's Shirley Showalter, and now I'm speaking as Rosanna Landis Weaver. And Shirley was one of my mentors. I didn't know John very well. I knew Jessica. I interviewed John for the record when I was on campus, and he seemed quite middle-aged. And I have a different perspective now. But the story I wanted to mention, are you filming this? Oh, okay. Just so Sharada doesn't see it. When my oldest daughter, Sharada, was in Hyderabad, we adopted her from an orphanage in Hyderabad. And before we went, somebody, and I really can't recall who, said, oh, there are Mennonites in Hyderabad you could connect to. So we had one of them come and visit us at the hotel, and I remember very little of what he said. But I remember he was astonished that I knew who John Lapp was. And I was from Pennsylvania. I didn't think it was that unusual to know a Lapp, but I appreciated his perspective. And I think that is a perspective of John's life that maybe isn't here as much today, but people throughout the whole world, all the corners of the world, treasure him. So to his family, just warmest regards, and thank you for inviting us all to be in this memory time together.
Everybody's doing so well with introducing themselves and saying who they are. I thought I might just put in a plug to keep doing that as people are sharing. It's really nice. Yeah.
I could say something about his laughter. I was from Pennsylvania. We grew up with the Lapp family. Some of the boys were friends of ours. But he also came to Goshen as provost, dean, and then provost, and I was director of international education. I'm Marlon Huntsberger. Thought I would better say that. I was director of international education, and we received 11 Chinese professors when we had our program there. And it was the end of the year, and we were having a final farewell dinner for them, and this was in the college dorm cafeteria. But it was a very formal sort of meeting of a grand send-off. So first of all, John and myself and some other faculty members sat in the front, and here was a crowd of people, and then the Chinese professors. So they gave their speeches. Or first of all, John gave a speech and a toast, and well, with water, of course, and so forth. And we were going on. It was nice in there. John made a nice speech, some others, and then it came to the turn for the Chinese professors. And John was provost at the time, by the way. Very important word. Anyway, the head of the team, he was the first one to speak, and he gave praises to this John Lapp for being the provost of the college, making all this possible. And he knew John was provost, but he was not too strong in English. So he kept referring to how wonderful Pervert Lapp was. I was sitting beside John. And so he kept, I think he mentioned pervert 10 times. And John was right beside me. I'd poke him and like, pervert. And you know, John, they talk about his laughing. He couldn't do the donkey laugh because the man would have hurt him. But he did do his little belly laugh, and he was shaking so shaking so hard the chairs were ran out. So I think the person must have heard him, but didn't know what it was all about.
For those of you who are playing the game, that was the time to eat a Wilbur Bud, right? No, that was perfect.
My name is Richard Kaufman. I consider John a friend, and there were numerous times throughout our lives where we made different kinds of connections. But my first memory of John was when I was a teenager. I think it was when he was at MCC Peace Section office, and our church, my home church, Nessville, invited him to speak on a Sunday morning. And my parents were always the lay people in the congregation who would invite guest speakers home. And I was always kind of thrilled to sit around and listen to the adult conversation. That's really where my interest in the church and theology came from, hearing my parents talk with people like John Lapp. Well, John was a part of that generation that was trying to pull the Mennonite church out of the more quiet in the land stance and become more activist. And that really wasn't my dad's cup of tea. And they had, Ron here. Ron's my cousin, so he knows what I'm talking about. But they had this very respectful conversation with each other. And at the very end, they agreed that they can agree that war is bad. And that's where it came out at the end. There was a lot more that they didn't agree on. A more recent story, some of you have probably heard this story, but a couple of years ago, it was probably before COVID, Jack Suderman came up to me at Pastor's Week in Elkhart, AMBS. He was all excited. He wanted to tell me a story, and it turned out it was a story about John Lapp. And I saw Willard Swartley standing over there, and I was like, hey, Willard, come on, you got to get in this story. It's about your brother-in-law. So Jack and his wife, they did, I don't know if they still do or not. Jack was the executive director of MCC Canada, or Mennonite Church Canada, excuse me. And here was the story. Jack and his wife had led a tour to Cuba, as they did numerous times, and the last one that they led, John and Alice were on it. And he said, I always take these Mennonite tours to meet the people at the Cuban Council of Churches. And on this particular occasion, they went to the Cuban Council of Churches, and of course the head of the Cuban Council of Churches gets up and gives a little address. And he looked at the group, and he looked at this one man there, and he says, you are John Lapp. And John says, yes, I am. Well, how do you know me? Oh, I saw your picture and name in literature for Mennonite Central Committee. He went on to thank MCC for the canned food that they had sent after the Soviet Union dissolved, and they weren't getting assistance anymore from the Soviet Union, and the Cuban economy was in dire straits at that point. And they were getting food, ships, of course, from Canada, because we had an embargo on things going to Cuba at that point, to them. And he wanted to tell John, thank you for what MCC had done. Afterwards, the head of Cuban Council of Churches assistant, a woman, came to him, and she was in tears. She came to John, and she says, you know, my husband was a child at that point. His family was a recipient of that meat. I think my husband would not have survived if they hadn't had that Cuban meat. So the next time I saw John, I said, I heard this story about you. I want to hear your side of the story. He told me the story, but John being John, he was so humble about it. It was way more exciting to hear Jack tell the story because he didn't mind bragging up John, but John was not about to brag up himself. Another side of his humility.
I'm Robert Lurch, the eldest of John's grandsons, and I'm sharing some memories from both myself and my sister. We lived fairly close by to Grandma and Grandpa when they were retired in Akron, and both of us, when we were younger, went for grandparents' camp where we learned to make pies with Grandma and played mini golf with Grandpa and spent a week down there just enjoying time with our grandparents and being able to do activities with them, go places with them, and get a bit of a break from just being around each other and our parents all the time. And we both also remember all the games of hide and seek, both with Grandma and Grandpa and with all of our cousins, and sneaking into Grandpa's study to hide in his study when we were playing hide and seek with the grandparents in Akron. And all the games and everything we played at that house, it was some of the most enjoyable times of childhood.
John F. Lapp, or JF, as many of you know me, oldest child of John and Alice. Excuse me. First of all, I want to thank so many of you for sharing, and I'm not wrapping it up here, but just wanted to thank you, and thank especially those of you who have been such religious visitors of Dad in the last couple of years when he was so much in need of that, and he appreciated it very much from each of you, the visits that he had and the conversations. And it was sad for us to see that as he was less and less able to have those conversations in full, and yet you continued to visit him, and we thank you for that. I, as the oldest and as the only son, had both good and some challenging memories. I was not always as successful in life as my dad would have been happy for. I won't tell you some of the more colorful stories, but one that still comes to mind on occasion was one time when he and I were out in our rowboat on that Goshen Dam pond down there, and we had a rowboat, and as I was ready to pull away from the shore, for some reason Dad stood up right at that moment in the back, and he ended up not very wet, but not very happy with me as he went down into the water. Dad's impact on me, however, long-term was exceptional. Many of you know that Sandra and I have pursued international service with MCC, and I also work with Mennonite Mission Network in international related things. And all of that came from the experience, the stories, the relationships that Dad and Mom had around the world. And that piqued my interest in that kind of work, and so was really, Sandra and I have both been very happy and honored to be able to sort of carry on that tradition. I don't have the kind of academic or even leadership abilities that Dad had, but it's been wonderful to be able to follow along in that tradition as far as it goes. And we're currently here for a couple of weeks from Egypt. We are still with MCC. I guess just want to say thank you all for coming here today, and look forward to some more conversations with you after this time. But others that want to share, please do.
My name is Victor Koop. I'm the other Victor. At Goshen College, there was Victor, and then there was the other Vic. Both of us thank John for hiring us, or at least he hired me. But it didn't go very smoothly at the beginning. My family and I were rather excited when we approached the international border. We come from the country north of here. And it's a long story, but it's humiliating to be escorted by a police officer with a naked pistol. Canadians don't see naked pistols. Long story short, my wife is crying. My 2 daughters are sobbing. Why can't Daddy join us? There's an officer with a pistol holding him away. They took me into court in Detroit, and the question was, can you find somebody who would vouch for your honesty, that you're not sneaking? Our assumption is you're sneaking into that college called Goshen. Can you identify somebody? They opened the mic in the court, and the judge calls ad 13. I sort of know who the secretary was at the time, won't mention the name. And the judge says, we would like to speak to, this is for the Lapps, you have a different name. We would like to speak to Dr. Plapp. And that didn't go over too well, either in the courtroom or here. This wonderful secretary said, there is nobody here by the name of Dr. Plapp. And that cooked my goose. That assured the court that this guy is a fake. That's the first part of the story, but I thank John Lapps that he became a friend of mine, and I often talk to him about that event, and he said to me, I would never want to go through that again because it got to be really technical. Anyways, greetings to all the Plapps.
I'm Bev Lapp, and this is my brother Tony, and our dad Sam was number 5 of the 9 Lapps. And I just want to express gratitude to these 9 siblings for how hard they've worked at their relationships. They love each other deeply, and they had a very eventful, amazing, sometimes hard childhood, and have really worked at maintaining close bonds, and that has been such a gift to the rest of the extended family. About, I guess it was fall of 2022, John was starting to fail, and Dad was very, very sick. And there was a little time there where we weren't sure who would die first. And I don't remember if it was Jennifer or Jessica. Yeah, Jessica and I got them on FaceTime video. I was in Pennsylvania, and we knew they weren't going to see each other again. But you all have that experience of being on video, looking at each other, and one person in a smaller box than the other one. And I just have never seen such a tender look go across technology like that conversation was. And it happened with all the other siblings during those hard months as well. But that memory just stays with me the look of tenderness that they gave each other. And I think that is symbolic of this very special family of siblings and extended ones. My last visit with Uncle John was with my cousin Kenton Swartley, and I regretted that I didn't get back there again after that, but it was just a few weeks before he died, and it was hard to maintain conversation, but he was very kind and gracious and kept trying to get phrases out, but as we left, he kind of reached for me and almost grabbed me, and he was struggling to get something out, and he looked at me, he said, "Don't let the ones in the center run everything." Don't let the ones in the center run everything. And I couldn't tell, just based on other parts of the visit, if that's what he meant to say, but I decided that is really good advice. I'm gonna go with that from my Uncle John.
We're going to invite any therapists and pastoral counselors to meet in the corner afterwards, and we're going to deconstruct all of this, right? All right.
My name is Ken Sensenig, and I knew John on the tail end of his MCC service. I served with MCC for a number of decades, just retired last month. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, sometimes the little pieces that seem insignificant at the time actually become central to the story. Now, I knew John and Allie. We had been invited into their home, as their habit was, when we were preparing for MCC service in Sudan in 1991. And when we returned again in 1994, John, of course, was in the executive office of MCC. I knew him. I would walk past his office. I knew he was a global traveler. I knew he is a man with a string of degrees after his name. I knew he had a list of books he had written. And I knew that he was one that just had a grip on conditions in the world. But I wondered if I could connect with him. I wondered if he'd have time for this lad from a Lancaster County farm. And then something happened that transformed that. It was at this time of year. In fact, it was March 15. You know what that date was? If you look on your programs, it was John's birthday. 1995. I happened to be going past his office, and he was inviting staff members in, and he was serving birthday cake. Now, John didn't always pay attention to all the little details, so he didn't have napkins and paper plates and so forth. So he went and he got some brown paper towels torn out of the men's restroom, and he was serving birthday cake with brown paper towels. That opened a new vision of John for me. Here's a down-to-earth Lansdale man that can connect with my narrative and my story. And over the years, we became friends. He became a mentor to me. Our friendship followed him when they retired from MCC, and then they moved to Goshen. And then more recently, as the writer of Ecclesiastes said, when the keepers of the house tremble, our friendship continued, and I highly valued that. And so I reflect again, sometimes in the passing moment, we don't know how that tiny little insignificant snippet of memory or of learning will become a central piece. Brown paper towels torn from the dispenser in the men's room. And so today, for JF and for Jennifer and for Jessica, I have 3 pieces of cake in a brown paper towel that I'm going to leave with you.
My name is Ray Burbaker. Margie, my wife, and I came yesterday in time for the visitation, which was really great because I had time with John's siblings. And I can't remember with which one I was talking, and they told me that they had asked John some time back which of his professions did he like the most. And he said, teaching. Which is interesting because I went to EMC back in 1962 as a history major and was told immediately by anybody who was interested in history, he's the guy you've got to take courses from. So I had that opportunity. And then later on, my wife and I had served in Africa sometime and in Akron in the Africa department. And in 1989, John and Alice visited us in Elmira, Ontario, where he invited me to join him to help direct the international program of MCC, which we then moved the following year. And early in that term, he invited Chet Raber to come and be the expert on administration. And we met on a regular basis for a while with the department heads to learn the skills of administration. And I remember after one session with Chet, he passed out a paper and he told all of us to grade ourselves on the various disciplines that he had taught. Now, John was right at my elbow on this side, and I was grading myself, and he leans over to see what I was doing, and he was saying, how are you grading yourself? I'm not very good at this kind of stuff. So I never had the courage to go back to him because that had a double meaning. Was he referring to not being able to grade? Because he was my professor in history and graded a lot of my papers. Or was he referring to administration? Because I think our styles were somewhat similar because both of us were kind of weak in details, but we won't go into that. Yeah, so he and I would meet, I think, on a weekly basis to discuss program and stuff. So I would come with a few agenda items. He might have a few agenda items. And so we would get them done in a hurry. And then we'd both sit back and just talk about anything that came to our minds. That was the fun part. That could go on for 45 minutes. And then he would push back on his chair and say, okie doke. And that was the signal, it's finished. It's time to go. So I would go back to my office. Yeah, a number of you have referred to his humility. And it was true. I experienced that. But that meant he had a short tolerance of arrogance. So I remember at one meeting where this one person had written a book, and it wasn't a place to sell a book. I mean, they were meeting on stuff. And so I was out in the hallway, just happened to be out there with John, and this guy was there somewhat inappropriately pitching his book. And John said, some people have no shame. What a pompous ass. Now, since we're not in the sanctuary, you can finally get that word out of the closet, you know. Yeah. And we've also talked about his flexibility, and that was true too. But I found out there are certain things for him that are fairly sacred. And CPS is one acronym that he did not want to be duplicated. Because when I was working with him in the 90s, I came up with a program that I wanted to call Connecting People Through Service, where it would kind of stop that one-directional flow of people from the north going to the south. I was going to try to get something that we could get mutuality going. And so I said, hey, I want to call it CPS 2. Nope. No. CPS stands alone. You don't mess with that acronym. So he was pretty serious about that because CPS, was that the program that he served in when he did alternative service? No. Okay, but anyway, he had a high regard for CPS and didn't want anybody duplicating that. So good memories.
That was at least Wilbur Budd number 2. So. We have in our house, it's something of a chandelier, which is a little out of place. We're not really chandelier kind of people. But it comes from Uncle John and Aunt Allie's house. but it also has more history behind it because for any of you that ever ate in their dining room in Akron, this hung above the table. But it was a lamp that had originally come from our, it would be my paternal grandmother's family. So it'd be Uncle John's mom. And it goes back 2 generations above her. And my dad's the one who wired it and turned it into a lamp that you could turn on with a switch. But I love this thing because it feels so connected to cross generations. It's my son's great-great-great-grandparents, but it also was in the home of my aunt and uncle who were so connected to so many parts of the world. So every time we turn it on, I think about it, honestly. Any other final stories we're going to bring? Oh, it was. It made it there. I forgot that. Okay. So it was when they moved then into Waterford that they, okay. Thanks. Yeah.
I'll end us on a lighter note. I'm Lisa Way, and John's my uncle. I was niece and nephew number, 16, 17, something like that on the Lapp side of the family. And I remember going to the house in the apple orchard because we loved the trees out back. We were little, Tom and I, when we would go there. And I remember one time at dinner, Uncle John was saying grace before our Sunday dinner, and it was going on. And I probably wasn't paying attention. Well, I definitely wasn't paying attention to the prayer. And I was probably 9 or 10 at the time. And I was sitting next to Dad, and he started laughing. And then I kind of perked up. What's going on here? And then somebody else at the table, I don't know if it was maybe JF who started laughing too. Mary started laughing. And then I was kind of looking around this is getting interesting. Why are people laughing at Uncle John? You don't laugh at Uncle John, okay? Prayer ended, and Mary and Dad burst out laughing. And during the prayer, John was remembering, thanking for the food, for the lovely setting, and I'm sure, and remembering those members of the Lapp family that were not present with us at the table, but instead of saying the members at large, he prayed for the larger members of the Lapp family. And I guess Dad and Mary were the only ones paying attention to the prayer.
That's wonderful. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Ethan.
We can finish after this, it's okay. So my name is John Ethan Lapp, 4th John Lapp in a row, and tallest grandchild. And I don't necessarily have a specific story to tell about Grandpa, but I did just want to say that throughout my life as I was growing up, I never quite understood the importance of the John Lapp name. And it always was kind of a minor annoyance to me too, always having to correct teachers and whatnot. But as I've gotten older, I really started to understand the kind of impact that he had on the world and the impact he had to everyone here in this room and just around the world too. And as I kind of came to understand that, I really started to think more about this name that I had the honor of carrying on into this next generation. And I just hope that I'm able to have a very small percentage of the impact that he had on the world. And I thank you all for sharing so many stories today. And yeah, I'm honored to have the name John Lapp and carrying it forward from this day on. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all. John Letterack, where are you? I should have figured out where you were beforehand, John, sorry. It's going to bring us to a close today. Thank you.
I had the the distinct privilege over these last months, maybe even part of the whole year, that I visited with John about 2 times each week, sometimes 3. And I looked forward to those times. It was not something that was a burden to do. It was like a mission of grace. And I'd like to reflect to you a bit about that. I was in to see John late Tuesday afternoon, his final day. I thought then that it was going to be my last visit. We sat in silence for a long time. His breathing was slow. He was not speaking. A man of many words, spoken and written, were now no more. That silence was broken with this benediction that I said to him each time before I left. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face to you and give you peace. Holding John's hand and saying my final goodbye, my last word to him was, I'll see you in the morning. Now, John has gone from us and from me and you, and this ends a close relationship of a lifetime. We were children together in Eastern Pennsylvania. He was my roommate in high school. At my age, 92, I realize that my days are numbered. See you in the morning, what does that mean? I'm not sure, but I trust in a loving and caring God who knows. I also said the last goodbyes to my wife, Naomi. Over the past years, John's life was closing down and getting smaller by the day. I would visit with John. The lifelong companion, Alice, had died. I use the word dead because that's a strong and complete word. John no longer has an office. John is living without his books. Church periodicals on the nightstand rest in their position unread. John is confined to one small room. In that room, reflections of education are surprisingly absent. In that room, the congregations that were so dear to him are no longer part of his life. In that room, his friends come and go. John is no longer part of a congregation. They just come to visit. The world, which includes many nations and churches and meetings with executives and presidents, now reduced to the quietness of that small room. It looks out upon a prairie. Interesting. John would look out that window and point on many occasions. I don't know quite what he was seeing. Something about that prairie was a fascination to him. John, the project coordinator of the Global Mennonite History Series, this was his final gift to the world of Mennonites. John, the historian, is resting his pen. John, the college administrator, is no longer sending memos. John, the Mennonite Central Committee executive, a servant leader, and always a peace advocate, is now living in that small room. John's life journey has ended. but always with grace. Demut goes hand in hand with Hochmut. Demut is defined as humility or an individual's quiet grace. Hochmut is pride and aggressiveness. When I visit with John, I often reminded him of the significance of his life and work. And during those final weeks, I would lead him through a life review. Sometimes his thought life, sometimes his work. And when I suggested John, you were a special gift. When, where, and wherever you lived, your work and writing are so significant. John, the Mennonite world looked out with you out of that East Jerusalem window and saw a much wider world. He would listen, comment humbly but perceptively. He would say, no, not more than others. I would say, oh, my dear John, Demut flowed through your mother's milk and sank deep through your father's quiet voice. Demut is embedded in your very being. And it was. Soon after John died, and my friend Glenn Miller also died, my daughter Beth sent me a poem that she wrote thinking of my grief. This is what she said. We remember what was written long before this script we live in. Common is our history. One set of roots, our family tree. From trunk to leaves, one progeny. Our bodies, one humanity. Yes, there is so much more than what we see. Then I think she wrote this last line especially for me. How about we see all of us as kindred souls we love and trust? John was never ordained. I think he ruminated upon that reality, and I would assure him the significance of his outstanding life was complete, absolutely complete, without ordination. Each of my visits with my friend John, I would depart by saying some of this just like this. John, your father ended many of the worship services with this most ancient benediction. These words could well be the oldest words of recorded history. Tradition even says, to magnify their importance, they were told by God to Moses, Moses to Aaron, and Aaron to give them to the people. And now, I to you. It seems right that maybe we just pause a moment in silence. Been many words today, and maybe it'd be good just to be silent for a few moments before we close the meeting. Pause for a moment with me. I break this silence with this ancient benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face to you and give you peace. Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.